A mom was driving in the car with her son and daughter who were fighting in the back seat. You know how it goes. She looked at me. He poked me. She's on my side. Despite Mom's repeated warnings, it went on and on. At her wit's end, nearly in tears, Mom finally pulled the car over, and borrowing a line from Jesus, she shouted, "I command you to love each other." It was silent for a long time. And finally the little boy said, "Mom, you can make me act nice to her, but you can't make me love her." To which the mom said, "Honey, if you act nice to your sister, you are loving her, whether you think you are or not." Jesus gave his disciples this new commandment: love one another, just as I have loved you. But why do we need a new commandment now, here, at the Last Supper? The answer lies in these words: when Judas had gone out. Now that Judas has left the table, everything is different. Judas has gone out, but this does not change what Jesus does. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus gave Judas the bread. He handed himself over to Judas. And then Judas went out in the night to hand Jesus over. Every time we gather to share this meal, we remember this moment on the night he was betrayed. We never mention Judas by name, but he's there in the background, in the shadows. The new commandment is given in the darkness of that night. In John's Gospel, Jesus is the light of the world. And after Judas went out, John comments, "It was night." This darkness calls to mind the story of creation in the book of Genesis. For in the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God spoke over the darkness, over the formless void. There's a wonderful Hebrew phrase to describe this chaos and darkness: tohu vabohu. God commands light in the darkness. God brings order out of chaos. God separates the dry land as a place of refuge from the waters that covered the earth. The story of creation is told in the first book of the Bible. And the book of Revelation is the last book of the Bible as we have it. And now today we have a story of a new creation. Then I, John, saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. It's kind of curious that John would say the sea was no more. It's not like God has something against water. After all, in the beginning, the Spirit of God breathed over the waters. But out of the darkness, out of the chaos, out of that formless void, the tohu vabohu, God brought life and light and established order. But for the Jews, water was still a place of chaos and fear. The Israelites never had a navy. And if you wanted to travel by sea, you would prepare yourself for months. It would probably be the end of your life. Paul was shipwrecked, I think, 3 or 4 times. So to say that the sea is no more is to say that formless void, darkness, and chaos will be no more. So we're brought back home to Eden, where God will wipe every tear from their eyes, where death will be no more, and mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." You probably imagined the throne would not look like a cross. But in John's Gospel, the cross is the throne from which Jesus redeems and completes the work of creation. On the cross in John's Gospel, Jesus said, "It is finished." Creation is now completed. God doesn't make new things, but rather God is making all things new. It is love poured out that transforms and redeems the world. This transforming love begins at the Last Supper, when Christ reveals God's glory in the midst of the darkness that threatens to overwhelm them, in the midst of a group of disciples who would hand Jesus over in betrayal and denial. And it continues as often as we eat this bread and drink this cup. In his first letter to the Corinthians, St. Paul wrote, "Because there is one body, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread." Emeritus Pope Benedict commented on these words of Paul. He wrote, "In the Eucharist, Christ personally unites himself with each one of us, but Christ himself is also united with the man and woman who are next to me. And the bread is for me, but it's also for the other. Thus, Christ unites all of us with himself, and all of us with one another. In communion, we receive Christ, but Christ is likewise united with my neighbor. Christ and my neighbor are inseparable in the Eucharist." The Old Commandment, the Ten Commandments, enacted God's first covenant with Israel. And just as in this new covenant, there are two parts: love God and love your neighbor. But notice, when Jesus gives the new commandment at the Last Supper, he forgot to mention God. He commanded us to love one another, just as I have loved you. When we love with the same love that loves us, God is present. Jesus loved by giving himself away, by losing himself. Genuine love always means losing oneself in another's arms, in another's laughter, in another's tears. But more, to love is to lose oneself and thereby find oneself, to find one's true humanity. The way people come to know and love the divine is through the human. God's dwelling place is among mortals. Last Saturday, Pope Francis showed us again what this love might look like. He went to the Greek island of Lesbos and brought 12 refugees from Syria, including 6 children with him, back to Rome. The refugees are staying with the Sant'Egidio community in Trastevere in Rome. Sant'Egidio is a lay Christian community whose mission is to be friends with the poor. We visited the community last October on our trip to Rome. On the return plane trip, Pope Francis showed the reporters a drawing given him by one of the children in the camp. It showed the son weeping. The Pope said, "If the son is able to cry, so can we. A tear will do us good." The author of the book of Revelation, which above all else is more like a picture book, would have seen in the son weeping an image of God weeping over the plight of the refugee children. For John wrote, "God will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples." Whenever Israel imagined their relationship with God, they imagined it like a bride married to the bridegroom. Like we heard today, Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. Pope Francis just published his apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, which has to do with our relationships and with marriage. Francis wrote, "We have to realize that all of us are a complex mixture of light and shadow. The other person is more than the sum of the little things that annoy me. Love does not have to be perfect for us to value it. The other person loves me as best they can with all their limits, but the fact that love is imperfect does not mean that it is untrue or unreal. The new commandment to love is given at the very moment that love is betrayed. Pope Francis captured it very beautifully in this takeaway: love does not have to be perfect. We keep practicing in the hopes of getting it right. As the mother said to her son, "Honey, if you act nice to your sister, you are loving her, whether you think you are or not."